Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us and welcome to the second ThreatX webinar here on Bright Talk, battling the rapidly evolving threat landscape with practical insights. I'm your host, Diana Kelley, CTO and founding partner at SecurityCurve, and today I am so excited to be joined by Bret Settle, who is the President and Chief Strategy Officer at ThreatX. Hi, Bret.
Hi, Diane. Great to be talking to you.
Great to have you here today. Together, we're going to be exploring how security teams can defend themselves from new attacks by adopting a unified attack-centric approach, and how to balance performance, which is always a challenge, with security. So thank you again for being with us. Let's get started. Bret, application security is really entering a new era, and as we're recording this, we are just a couple of days away from Log4j. And that's highlighting so much about the software supply chain and how much it impacts organizations. And really, what it means to the companies and how it can just spread beyond where organizations think that the attacks are going to be able to infiltrate them. So the question is that, as companies are juggling all these different security tools that they try and address to take a look at what's going on in their supply chain, that they can almost create another problem, which is tool sprawl. So why do we need tools to help us manage the software supply chain? And what happens when we have too many?
Yeah, well, it's a great question. And I think, as you look at the market, there are literally thousands of different vendors out there covering various aspects of security up and down the OSI stack. And oftentimes those, platforms approach it differently, different layers of the stack or maybe different techniques that they're operating under. So it's very easy to, get excited about the new candy and the new, shiny lights that we're seeing out there and think it's going to solve a particular problem. But as you continue to add more and more products, obviously most of them weren't built to operate together. And so you create this enormous amount of information that requires you to then process through and try to decipher what's the holistic picture here and what are we really looking at from an overall attack perspective. And so I think, in my prior career where I was on the other side of the fence and dealing with these products, we were very careful to evaluate the products, but also really try to understand how did they fit into our overall security architecture framework and how did we best understand how we were going to adopt the new information while still having kind of a complete visibility that we were looking for across all the tool sets.
And that visibility is so important. And I love the way you talk about the candy, because it's true. We can get sort of distracted by those bright, shiny objects. Sometimes smaller companies and even medium-sized companies can say that tool sprawl isn't a problem for them. And managing software and applications is different for the big or the littler companies. What are you seeing? Is this really just a large company problem, or do medium and smaller companies need to be looking at this?
Yeah, from my perspective, obviously the larger companies, they have a lot more resources. Sometimes security is being distributed across multiple teams or multiple business units. And so with each of those groups, they have some level of autonomy to pick different tools and, come up with their own architecture. But having said that, I think what we see is that even the small and medium-sized companies, it's a really complex problem. And there are a lot of different areas that you're trying to protect. And so again, the same kind of shiny lights or eye candy and the marketing messages, which all good companies are so great at, talking about how this is going to solve a lot of different problems. It creates situations where you buy a solution and you think it's going to cover 100% of the problem. And then you realize, hey, maybe it was only semi-adequate in that space and you need another solution. And before you know it, you have the same problem with multiple tool sets out there trying to accomplish, virtually the same objectives.
Yeah, and the board or the CFO are asking why the team is asking for more money. Didn't we just give you budget last year?
Exactly.
How about getting overwhelmed and what happens with teams? Right now we are just a couple days after Log4j. What are you seeing with how teams are handling the response? And in general, why are security teams getting so overwhelmed?
Yeah, well, I think, there's new attack vectors that come out all the time, and Log4j is just the poster child for
Yeah.
a zero-day attack. And, something that wasn't necessarily being picked up by a lot of the tool sets that were out there and required both new patterns to be able to identify the various attack, the attack vectors that they were coming from. But also, how did you go even understand, are you at risk? Do you have a good catalog and inventory of the applications that they're using, and an inventory of the third-party tool sets that you're using? How do you understand if you have been exposed? And so I think, it's a combination of different, products that are providing bits and pieces of the story, along with a pretty heterogeneous or distributed environment that you're even working in the first place, that created chaos is really what I think we were seeing. And so recommendations were coming out from the various authorities about how best to try to deal with the solution. And ultimately, addressing the vulnerabilities within the applications themselves is where you need to get. But given the fact that in a lot of cases, you can't just patch those systems and immediately make the changes, there's so many dependencies oftentimes on other solutions or other applications that you need some level of protection to allow you enough time to be able to react. And so again, for me, Log4j, you're seeing a lot of folks with bags under their eyes today as they've been chasing, the issue both upstream and downstream, trying to understand the impact, trying to get themselves in position to answer the questions: are they protected, or what level of risk are they really at right now?
It's incredible how with a standard it can seem so simple. Everything has to be patched within 2 weeks or 30 days or 24 hours, but then when you're on the ground, it's a lot more complex than that.
Right.
Another area that's been pretty complex and a challenge in application security and application security testing and even vulnerability testing is the issue of false positives. And this has been a challenge for us for many years. I was wondering if you could explain a little bit more about what false positives are, why they're such a challenge for us with tooling to be able to eliminate.
Sure. Well, I mean, one of the things I've always said is nothing kills a security mandate faster than false positives, because at the end of the day, people are really concerned about security unless it's impacting, performance, unless it's impacting availability, or unless you're shutting out legitimate users of these systems. And so security teams are constantly battling, the balance that they have to strike in terms of ensuring they've got the right level of protection, but also making sure that they're not causing outages within, the solutions. And so false positives, a lot of what has driven false positives in the past is that most of the solutions out there are looking at a single transaction, and then they're trying to match a known behavior, malicious behavior that's out there. And while that works, maybe, for a little while, the application environment is so dynamic, and you're seeing so much customization. You're seeing third-party adoption or plugins or other components that are being baked into these solutions. And so what may have worked at one point suddenly starts to match legitimate capabilities or legitimate functions of those applications over time. And so, it's just a never-ending battle of trying to adjust the rules so that they are adequately blocking what they need to block, but aren't causing the false positives. And I think, that's been the challenge that's really plagued the industry. What we've seen and what we've always said is, especially in the space that we play in for layer 7 for applications and APIs, most companies are protecting as little as 10 to 15%, because the challenge of the operational burden of constantly evaluating those tools and evaluating kind of the protection policies that are in place just becomes an overwhelming burden for their security teams.
That's so true. And what about if we flip that, we do the 180? What about false negatives? Or what risk do they pose, and are they also a problem?
Yeah, well, I think that's, very insightful in terms of what we've seen with a lot of the tools in the industry is that they either don't get deployed, or in the case of blocking solutions like firewalls, maybe they minimize the rule sets and or don't even turn the blocking on, just simply because of the fear of the false positives. And what that's creating then is really a missing link or a lack of visibility as to what kind of suspicious and malicious traffic is really flowing through the solution. And again, you mentioned it earlier in this conversation. For us, I think it's always about visibility. How can we maximize the visibility into the type of traffic that's flowing through the solutions, because otherwise you're really flying in the dark and you're just kind of hoping that you've got enough protection in place to keep you safe without, impacting legitimate business transactions.
It's so true. When it comes to application security, no news is not necessarily good news.
Absolutely.
In terms of what your tools are telling you. There's a lot of discussion about how sophisticated attackers are getting, and that they're using multi-channel or mixed mode attacks, and they're very advanced kind of attack vectors. So what does that mean for a mixed mode attack, and why are attackers using that?
Yeah, I mean, the easiest scenario for me to describe really comes down to the use of, let's say, botnets to perform the attacks. When you think about, and we'll just use simple example of a static signature, maybe you want to block request or block an IP after you've seen X number of failed requests come through. And so, if you've got a simple rule like that you want to make sure that they're not attempting an account takeover or credential stuffing, so you want to block them when you see enough failures. The problem is, you can only ratchet that number so low before you start impacting legitimate users. And so there's a threshold that you have to set with that particular rule. And the bad guys know that. So what the bad guys are doing is they'll obviously understand where that threshold exists, and then they're going to distribute the load over, in many cases, tens of thousands, even 100,000 IPs that they'll use as part of the attack stream, so that they can go as low as they possibly can, stay under the threshold, but have maximum effect in terms of the overall attack. And these guys are always going to be smart. There's real financial gain on the other end of a successful attack, and so they can afford to acquire the IPs. They can afford to build the scripts to use evasion techniques. They can change key components. They can do hijacking. There's so many different tools and techniques that they can bring to bear that really are part of the overall attack that they're trying to instrument, that no single rule can really effectively identify what is truly suspicious or malicious versus what is just normal user behavior out there. So it becomes a huge and very complex environment, especially when the stakes are high and the financial impact of a breach is significant.
And when we think about it, as you point out, not one tool isn't going to do everything, but then there's also this management of tool sprawl. So how do we start thinking about being able to stop these very low and slow and trying to evade our detection, but not layer too many tools in? Is there a good way for companies to start thinking about how to do that?
Yeah, I mean, again, we use a concept that we call attacker-centric behavioral analysis. Okay. And really what we've done is we've said it's not good enough to look at single transactions and try to make a binary decision, good or bad, based on a very small amount of information. So what we've done is we've started to expand the capability to really focus on the attacker and then build the profile as we go, monitoring every interaction that they're having with an application, potentially multiple applications, potentially even across multiple customers, so that we can gain as much insight about who is on the other end, what type of behaviors are we seeing that are both suspicious, as well as what type of behaviors are we seeing that are, genuinely malicious, and then how do we use that as the process for us to understand when is it appropriate to block. And again, one of the things that it allows us to do is delay or defer the blocking until we get enough information to block them while they're in the early stages, while they're doing reconnaissance, while they're doing certain levels of discovery. You're seeing those indicators of suspicious behavior, but you don't have to block them yet, because at that point you're gaining the fingerprints of how they go about doing an attack. Then as they continue to progress and you have enough information to block them, you can make an accurate blocking decision. You can also have a fully correlated view to be able to justify why you made the blocking decision. And you also have key elements about the patterns that they were using, so that as they start to migrate from one IP to another IP or distribute that attack, like we talked about previously, you have enough information to be able to use multiple points of data to identify them very quickly.
Oh, that's wonderful. So you can transfer this pattern from one, you've seen it once, now when you see it in another customer, you can respond more quickly because yeah, that's great.
And again, we're not, it's not a complete reinvention of the wheel. You're
Mm.
still going to use, some techniques that are going to look for the obvious things, but you're again trying to put this in a more full context view. What you really want to understand is, how does this particular actor behave? How is it relevant to what we see from other legitimate users of the solution? And also, by picking up and fingerprinting the behaviors that they're using, you have a much better chance of identifying them when they move on. And again, there's other techniques that we would utilize, things like IP interrogation, various challenges, various fingerprinting that we do of the actual user agent information and other kind of key characteristics. All of
Mhm.
this basically incorporated into an overall view that allows us to be much, again, more effective at understanding who's really on the other end of the line, and what do we really think their purpose is, and then how do we understand, based on what they're doing, when it's appropriate to block them without impacting legitimate traffic as it flows through.
Yeah, which is such a key point. That was always way, way back in the day. I remember like the late 90s, we started to get excited about automated blocking until we realized that we were just stopped all the traffic in our network half the time.
Absolutely.
So, yeah, has to be very judicious. Okay, I was wondering if we could switch to APIs. And
Sure.
APIs have been around for a long time, but as we look at microservices and massive cloud adoption, what's the role that APIs are playing in 2022 and beyond for companies, and why is it so important to have defense for them?
Yeah, well, absolutely. I mean, in the digital age, what you're seeing is, either whether it's for compliance reasons or whether it's just to participate in this digital economy, you have to be able to provide integration capabilities and provide APIs to be able to play in that, commerce environment. And so the explosion that we're seeing, and as you said, APIs have been around for a long time, but what you're seeing now is just an explosion in the overall number of APIs that are out there. It's also become kind of a best practice from a development perspective. So if you have a web application and you have a mobile application and you want to participate maybe in a commerce group that's out there, you want to be able to reuse these APIs and provide that visibility or that access to that capability across each of those components, and do it as effectively and efficiently as you can. So it's a great development, and it's a great kind of component for us in this digital age to be able to grow and to be able to provide these capabilities. Obviously, though, it introduces a lot of potential for security risk. And some of this risk is really getting highlighted because of that. The very nature of an API and the reuse that you're seeing tends to make the development of those APIs where they are providing more information and they are supporting a lot of different users, and sometimes different users who have different behaviors or different techniques. And so it kind of complicates the detection of what's truly legitimate traffic flowing through versus what you're seeing from, the suspicious and malicious attacks that are going on.
Mm. And as you look at companies trying to defend their APIs or even intersecting with their partners through their APIs, what do you think? What are you seeing as some of the biggest mistakes or pitfalls that they make?
Yeah, sure. Well, I mean, some things are just based on how you actually develop the APIs. And
Okay.
so you always have to think about authentication and authorization. You have to understand, who's going to be using this API. How do we ensure that they are who they say they are? How do we ensure that they have access to the data? How do we ensure that as we develop these APIs, we're presenting the appropriate amount of data without disclosing too much information that could be used as part of an attack? And so there's a lot of things that you want to look at that are, kind of part of how you're developing these solutions. But as I said, it's a very difficult proposition to be able to constantly keep track of, has every API been developed with all of these components in mind? Is it
Mhm.
truly being used by the appropriate users? Is there the right amount of authentication going on? And so, just speaking practically from maybe my experience, with development organizations, you can teach best practices for development. You can teach best practices for building security into it, but there's always the potential for mistakes to be made. And so having an extra layer of security that sits out in front of your APIs and your applications is very, very important. And so, really, it's a multi-layer type of approach, from us, as is always recommended from a security approach, to be looking for key indicators of suspicious behavior and the execution or utilization of those APIs, while at the same time you're trying to build in the best practices from the development and engineering side as well.
And with APIs, how about API keys? What are they and why do they sometimes lead to risks and exposures?
Well, I mean, whether it's keys or whether it's any kind of, hijacking of critical information, what's always an attacker's best practice is to impersonate a legitimate user. And so being able to come at the attack vector and not be picked up as, a suspicious event, but be, seen as an actual legitimate user is important. So the more information they have, the more exposure they have to what keys are important, as well as the ability to mimic legitimate users is an incredibly successful technique that they use on APIs. And we didn't yet really talk about it, but when you think about it, protection for web applications has been around for quite a while now. But the APIs sitting behind those applications, a lot of companies really lacked the protection for those. And in some cases, they even assumed that, well, the authentication is being done out in front of the APIs. But I think what we're seeing is just, some examples of, the exposure from an API perspective. And in many of the cases where we see the attacks coming through, they kind of identify and look for the APIs behind the applications and then immediately start loading up on the APIs because they see them as being more vulnerable than even the web application components. And so again, it comes down to that visibility of understanding, is the API being used in the normal, logical business function that you would expect? Or is that API, because it is exposed externally, potentially a very rich target for multiple folks to be able to attack, again, with limited visibility as to whether they're appropriately using it or not.
Yeah, and that is such a great point. I mean, when we first were using APIs, we didn't give them, they weren't quite so powerful as they are now. Now you can get,
Exactly.
just the way that they're used, they really do create a hole, an exposure. Now, attacker-centric, you talked about that a little bit before. I was wondering if we could go back to that and do a deeper dive into what that means, both at ThreatX, but also how organizations might be able to take a more attacker-centric view to help protect themselves.
Yeah, well, I mean, I can go back to even the kind of founding of our company. When I go back, prior to what we tried to develop here from an attacker-centric perspective, most of the firewall, IDS, IP solutions, they were blocking at the request level, but they weren't necessarily trying to identify the actual IPs or the attackers. So what we ended up doing is there was a lot of information that we gleaned from the logs. And so then we would take our very smart, security architects or analysts, and they would pull all this information together, and then they would go through their own correlation process. Sometimes we did it with a SIM solution or a log correlation engine, and sometimes we did it based on some manual rules. But the point was, we were always trying to take a lot of noise, a lot of signal that was out there of various things that were being detected and various things that were being blocked, but we still had to go through a process of trying to reverse engineer them. Do we think this is coming from a unique set of attackers? And then is there something about those unique set of attackers that we can identify to help us block? And I think, so this concept has been around for quite a while, but from a performance and scalability, it was difficult to be able to go through that level of processing and that level of identification in real time or in line. So you saw a lot of this functionality being done kind of after the fact. And then based on whatever information you were able to glean about the attacker, you were still forced to then go back and say, how can I craft a single static rule or single static signature that's going to be able to identify, this set of information that just, basically indicates that whoever's on the other end is actually a bad actor. And then how do I actually block both at the request level, but also at the IP level? So I think, the mindset of really trying to say there's a lot fewer users or attackers to deal with than there are the actual transactions that are flowing through. And so your ability to go through and process those transactions, the ability for you to really start focusing on the attacker itself, and then identifying what you're seeing as it's flowing through the, through the systems, indicators of both suspicious behavior, but also indicators of truly malicious behavior, and really using that to help guide how quickly can we identify the IPs that need to be blocked. Obviously, everybody uses threat intel, but the reality is, that threat intel is usually good for 24 to 48 hours. And after that, they're not using that IP anymore. And so, it's good for blocking the maybe less sophisticated attackers. And so you may get a lot of hits on your threat intel, but the reality is the sophisticated attackers quickly move on from those IPs to another set of IPs. So you need to be able to identify the actual behaviors that they're using and the key elements that are fingerprints of who those attackers really are, in order to be effectively keeping up with them as they continue to move, as well as they continue to morph their attack behaviors as well.
That makes a lot of sense, yeah, because as they figured out, well, if I just take everything out of the database today, that's going to trigger an alert. But if I take a little bit about, at a time, that may not trigger the alert. But if you're looking at the totality of the behavior of that actor, you start to see one action isn't suspicious, but the totality of their actions is clearly
Absolutely
malicious. Yeah, that's a great way to think of it.
I've got plenty of examples that we could probably go through.
Yeah.
I would say large shoe manufacturers constantly dealing with, the sneaker net attacks. They want to introduce new shoes, but they're afraid, or they have to protect themselves against the botnets coming in and basically purchasing all the, sneakers and then selling them on the black market. The challenges that they have are some of the techniques they're using are bot related, because they're sending in, hundreds of thousands of IPs as part of the overall attack. Some of it is that they're actually able to launch the attacks not just from kind of the normal IPs, but maybe residential IPs. So that takes, it's one less indicator of suspicious behavior. Maybe it's a combination of, various suspicious purchasing requirements, or maybe it's certain things about the actual IPs themselves that are suspicious in nature. And so what we've seen working with some of our larger customers is they're using a lot of different tools today. So they're using a bot solution to pick up pieces of the information. They're using a WAF solution to try to detect certain malicious behaviors, and maybe even the load that they're under presents itself as a DDoS style of attack. Maybe they're approaching not just the web components, but also the API components. And the reality is, the feedback as we kind of work through this with these customers is, in today's world, they're absolutely doing what I talked about before. They're pulling log information from each of these independent tool sets, and then trying to very quickly identify the patterns and then push back out a policy change in one or more of those other solutions. And I think that's really, when I talk about attacker-centric, it's the ability to not be using necessarily 4 different tools and then trying to figure out how to go build a policy in each of those 4 tools, but actually using a single risk engine that's actually taking inputs from, in our case, proprietary, custom built detection sensors that are looking at all of these different attack types, and then feeding the information in and looking at it again more holistically. And I think, we've seen cases with financial institutions where, again, they've got a web component to their banking application. They've also got a mobile component to their banking application, but they're seeing the scale of a DDoS attack distributed across such large botnet networks for part of these attacks, that keeping up with the permutations and the changes that these attackers are going through, and then again dictating the policies to multiple solutions, it's an unwinnable battle for them. And so again, when we talk about attacker-centric, what we're really talking about is being able to pick up those clues and multiple pieces of information, but allow us to not just block at the request level, but very quickly figure out these are the actual IPs that are truly malicious versus, in the case of a, grandma trying to log in and failing her login attempt 5 times, we want to continue to allow her to try to access the application, but definitely block the bad guys as they attempt to confiscate the credentials.
Right, and that tricky line when, if they've taken over grandma's router, now they're coming from that IP address. Yeah, it's a big challenge. And one of the ways to address that challenge is to have, as Ted Lasso would say, teamwork makes the dream work. Yeah. What does a modern application security team look like now, and what are they using? What's a modern security platform like?
Yeah, well, I think it's identifying some of the solutions that we've kind of talked about here that are maybe best of breed for various layers of the attack, but also working, on the front end in terms of how those applications are being developed, in terms of best security practices, in terms of testing and vulnerability scanning that's required, it takes kind of that full layered approach to ensure that you know, actually are covering the bases as best you can. And then you really need to think about, as you're building that architecture out, how are each of these components really going to integrate or correlate together, so that you don't end up with maybe the sprawl that we talked about at the beginning, where it's almost an information overload. I'm getting so many different signals that are coming out there from all these different tool sets, but there's no real cohesive understanding of what we're looking at from a security perspective. And so it's like, you know, combination. What we, you know, always try to do is say, can we take the factual information about what we're detecting and what's actually being targeted, and then can you augment that set of information with what you're seeing from your testing solutions? Can you use this to help the prioritization of addressing some of these vulnerabilities? Because you now don't just have the fact that you have a vulnerability, but the fact that you actually know how many unique attackers and how many different techniques are they using to try to exploit those different vulnerabilities. It's really piecing the information together kind of from beginning to end, so that you have, you know, as little information as you need to work with, but as broad a perspective in terms of, you know, what's really important to look at here.
Yeah, going from Brownian motion to something that has a coherence.
You got it.
Years ago, the great Barry Boehm did a lot of research and posited and said that, you know, if we could find and fix flaws in systems and design early, it's going to be much cheaper than solving them and fixing them later. And we've talked a lot about, once an application's out into production, what can be done to protect it and shore up defenses. But what can we do about learning how that application is being attacked and behaving in production? What can we do to go back earlier into the chain and help the development team create more resilient and resistant software?
Yeah,
How do we use that intel? Sorry.
Sure. And I think, you know, again, vulnerability scanners and some of the testing tools that are out there, fabulous products and very effective at what they do. But at the end of the day, they're also still working off of a kind of known baseline. They're working off of a known set of, you know, potential vulnerabilities or risk components for the application. So that's really what I'm, you know, kind of speaking to, as well as saying you have that perspective and that viewpoint that you're getting from those tool sets, having also the perspective and the viewpoint from, you know, what is the traffic patterns that you're seeing in the wild, and what are you seeing in terms of the various suspicious and malicious traffic? What is it that they are targeting? What techniques are they using? And be able to understand, you know, do I have complete coverage in terms of how I'm testing my solutions? Are there new, you know, 0 days? Are there new techniques that are being used? Or do I just need to be aware that I have a certain amount of risk in this application, and some of which I can control and some of which I can't control? And it's really being able to understand and kind of find that dividing line, so that you have that level of perspective around what does your true threat posture look like as you're working through this. Again, we integrate today with a number of different obvious, you know, SIEM solutions that are out there. But interestingly enough, we're starting to see a ton of integration from the service, you know, the orchestration engines or the SOAR platforms that are out there. And we're seeing integration from both sides of the equation. Information that they're picking up deeper in the stack, they obviously want to integrate that threat intel into our platform, so that as we see those IPs or even certain behaviors coming through, we can identify that much more quickly. But then also what we're seeing in the real world and in real time in terms of the various attacks, how do we integrate that very quickly into those orchestration engines so that they can both apply protection, but also, again, highlight where in the application, you know, is this vulnerability exist, and then what can be done to shore up that vulnerability. And, you know, we talked about it a little bit or around the edges of it, but keeping up, I mean, I think the platitude that you mentioned there is a great platitude, but then there's the practical reality. And so trying to build in this level of security into your, you know, applications is always a trade-off. But what helps you understand the prioritization is really understanding what is the level of risk of that particular component. And part of the risk is, you know, based on the data that can be exposed, but part of the level of risk is if you know that there are, you know, 100 unique actors, you know, actively trying to bang away against that component, clearly that's something that you want to go and address, and you want to prioritize and make sure that you've got, you know, as much as you can of the vulnerability addressed in the underlying application itself.
Yeah, it's a great point. Sometimes it may not be, that component doesn't seem like it's connected to something that's very sensitive, and it may not be, but it's connected to another piece in the chain, and so it's the way in, it's the soft area in. You've seen a lot. You've seen people or bots try and buy sneakers so that they can later sell them for markup. You've seen complex multi-channel financial attacks. What would you say are some of the best top-level guidance that you would like to see security teams doing that would really help them to shore up their defenses?
Yeah, I mean, I think you're only as strong as your weakest link. Mm-hmm. And so I think, what we see is, again, and I'll go back to some of the metrics that we cited, a lot of companies look at their applications and their APIs and they decide, what's most important and what are the crown jewels that they're looking for, and they want to circle the wagons around the crown jewels, because honestly, that's all that they really have maybe the resources for, or the funding to be able to protect. But the reality is, good attackers, they're going to be looking for those weak links. They're going to be poking around the edges. They're going to be looking at other opportunities, not just to access a solution, but it's where they do the reconnaissance. It's where they start to understand how your applications are managed, and it is potentially a weakness for you. So I think at the edge, you want to be as protected as you can. You want to have as much holistic coverage as you can at the edge to make sure that you're picking up on those potential attacks, even if it's an application or an area that you think is not as sensitive or not as interesting. Certainly you can gain your own set of intel and your own set of information by understanding what level of attacks that you're seeing out there, combined with a more holistic picture that you're seeing of attack information. Obviously, then based on that set of information, it's going to sometimes dictate or sometimes at least provide information around changes that you may want to make in terms of even your application infrastructure. So an example I would give is when we bring customers on to our platform, because we're able to help them understand what's being targeted and kind of the level of risk that we're seeing, we can decipher the information and maybe compare it to what we're seeing for other peers in their particular industry segment, helping them understand that, hey, maybe you're seeing a lot of attack traffic, but it's pretty normal. You're a financial institution. These components of your application are always going to be targeted more than other components because this is where the attackers tend to focus. But there's other elements that we tend to pick up on, and that it's things like, okay, maybe this segment of your applications is doing really, really well. And if I think of it in terms of a FICO score, these are really contributing to lowering your overall risk and really raising, maybe their score. But there's this other set of applications that, man, it's constantly under attack. Maybe it's a third party and they're not doing the kind of patching that they need to do. Or, hey, see the spikes that we're seeing? This kind of correlates to when they are releasing new software. They're constantly introducing new vulnerabilities. And so the bots are picking that information up and you're seeing an increase in your attack traffic. So it's getting that level of signal to help you understand where are the weak points in that proverbial chain that we talked about, and then understanding, are there things that you can do to improve your overall risk posture for each of those components of the chain. And so again, there's a lot of answers to your question, and I could go in 50 different ways, but I think it's, our approach has always been to understand that everything that's exposed externally is potentially at risk. Everything that's exposed externally has the potential to not only be an avenue for them to do an attack, but also an avenue for you to understand the approaches that they're taking and the techniques that they're using, as well as your relative risk in each of those areas. And having more visibility to then make smarter decisions about what you do with each of those components of your risk front there is, to me, one of the best things that you can really focus on.
Yeah, and such a great point about understanding the baseline of what your attack service, but also your attack activity looks like, because such a good point about the GSIFIs, the globally significant financial organizations. They're used to a much higher level of attack than maybe a small accounting company, for example.
Absolutely. So, and again, you can be under a lot of attack from very unsophisticated attackers. And that's a risk, but it's maybe a lower risk than a smaller number of attackers, but designating very sophisticated techniques and really going the extra mile and doing a much better job of evading and staying lower on the radar, those are the kind of things that represent more risk than necessarily just the overall amount of traffic that you're seeing and that you're dealing with. So
yeah, it's a great point. Yeah, if they're just spraying everybody with an attack, that's very different from one very well-resourced attack group going very specifically.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So at the top, we talked a little bit about balancing performance and availability and security, right? It doesn't make sense. We can't just go off the internet with our businesses, because then we can't benefit. But we also have to make sure that when we are on the internet, that we're keeping them secure. So, and we make sure that grandma, as you said, or grandpa can get to their bank account or buy their shoes.
Sure.
How? What are some of the ways that companies can start to do
Well,
this?
I mean, again, some of it's going to be technology related from my perspective. So, we've come a long way. And so techniques, even the techniques that we use, we operate in a reverse proxy mode. So we're an inline component. I can, 10 years ago, when I was on the other side of the fence, that would have scared me, just simply because, hey, that's got the potential for there to be a lot of latency. But the reality is, in this day and age, you're able to deploy in multiple data centers. You have failover, you have auto scaling, you have a lot of good techniques out there today that really allow you to make the level of at least inspection and even protection much, much less costly from a performance perspective. But having said that, and I'll take Log4j as the example, if you were to go build a regex style of inspection for every transaction that's going through and every possible permutation of the attack vector that they're looking at, then that would be a very long query for you to have to go through to pick up every possible combination that's going out there. So it's really having a better understanding of the type of attacks that you're under, the risk of the successful component of the attack, and then right sizing the amount of actual inspection, detection, and protection that you're putting out there. And so what we've been working with our customers on is we have solutions in place that have little to no impact on the performance, and they're covering 95% of the attack vectors that can be used for Log4j. There are, and we're explaining in very good detail to them, there are still these avenues. And so we're working with them on a customer by customer basis to say, if this is a big enough a risk, then you may want to add the 20, 30, 40 milliseconds worth of delay to this type of inspection, but doing it in a smart way so that you understand which applications you're protecting, whether or not that it's requiring that level of inspection to go through. So I think, again, we've come so far in terms of technology and the adoption of the cloud, the ability to put these solutions where it makes the most sense to really support customers' performance and scalability, that it's really no longer, to me, an option to say, hey, it's, I can't afford it from a performance and scalability perspective. But I think the level of detail and inspection that you go to is still something that's always going to be a trade-off, and something that you need to have the type of tools that have the flexibility and capability to expand or contract as necessary to support your business.
Yeah, great advice. And as you're looking forward in the next 12 to 18 months, what's one or two things that you think every company that's listening right now should go and address, take a look at their application security program and focus to make sure they're ready for the future?
Yeah, I mean, obviously API for me is going to be top of the list right now. Just, if you're not heavily invested in APIs today, you probably will be in the next 12 to 18 months, because it's just part of doing business. And so having, solutions in place that can help you both, from a testing perspective, from a best practices for development, super important, but also you're always going to need that extra layer of protection and something that can kind of be the front door, be the front gate to make sure that you're working as effectively and efficiently as you can. I think we're seeing a huge rise just in the use of managed services. And again, MSSPs have been out forever, but I think the benefits of managed services that are out there today, the visibility, you can have a very large company that has a very large security team, but at the end of the day, they're still really only going to have exposure to what they're seeing, currently in terms of the attack postures. To really be able to get further ahead, you can subscribe to threat intel feeds, you can do a lot of research, but at the end of the day, the MSSPs or the managed services they see these attacks early, they see them often, they see them across a lot of different technologies, and different customer bases. And so it's a great way to, get additional both support for your existing security organization, but also access to hopefully the latest and greatest, and the ability to respond to, the next 0 day that's going to pop up as fast and as quickly as we can. So.
Yeah, because unfortunately it will. Great advice. Take a look at what you're doing for APIs and security around them, and leverage the threat intel wisdom of the cloud and the crowd, especially with MSSPs. Thank you so much, Bret. This has been a really great discussion, and I really appreciate your time. I'm sure that the audience is also very appreciative of your time and your insights, and we're so glad that you were able to join us today for this conversation with Bret Settle of ThreatX on the rapidly evolving threat landscape and practical insights on how you can shore up your application security program and keep your organization safe. Thank you so much for being with us today. We'll see you next time.